Hey, folks.
Hello.
Does anybody have any agenda items for today?
It's going to be a quick meeting.
Yeah, if there's nothing on the agenda for today, I recommend we just cancel.
Yeah, there's one thing
Oh, sure.
I I feel like we probably ought to do some outreach so that people know this is the place they should come about and talk about their salsa tooling. I don't know that they do, whether they have developed something or they're working on something or they are looking for something. I mean, come on, it's always the same, like what, 4 or 5 people, yeah, six today actually. But you know what I'm saying is
Yep.
there's got to be more than that happening. We just don't see it. The people are not coming here. So I think it's unfortunate. I would like to know what people are doing. And I wonder what we should do, but I think we should socialize a little bit more that there is a place here where we intend to have conversation about this.
Yeah, no. And definitely could use some help on that one from anybody who might be able to help there, help promote because I've been talking on my end. I know a lot of folks who are working on on the West Coast are doing a lot of stuff on in Asia, are doing a lot of stuff on the salsa side. I know I actually have a meeting next week with some of the folks in APAC who are looking to do stuff on salsa. But as far as folks sort of Europe and US, I'm not super sure of who's working on what. I mean, I know I'm working on salsa related tools, but I'm not sure about other folks who are working on salsa related tools in the open source space.
Maybe we should enroll like Jennifer from the staff to help us with a bit of communication here. I don't know. But especially after Salsa 1.0, getting released, you would think there are people looking into, okay, what does it mean? And this should be the place they come for questions on what tools to use or what tools they're working on.
Yep. No, I definitely agree there.
Maybe it's a bit selfish on my part, but I always come here hoping that I'm going to learn about tools people are working on. And, no offense to you, Mike, I know you have Fresca, but okay, but beyond that. So,
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree. Uh, Actually, I mean, I know that looks like there's a couple of folks who are a bit newer to the meeting. I don't know if they are aware of anybody who's working on um some new tools or anything like that. But yeah, on my end, I'm not super sure.
So in that vein, I'm Matt Wood. I've joined the integrity work group a few times, and I'm going to be getting more involved in the salsa stuff from the spec and the tooling, because we're looking at what it takes to implement salsa, at least in principle, if not directly in some of our CI internally to the company. And so I'm looking around to see what the community is implementing on, right? GitHub Actions is obviously popular. Tekton seems is another one that I see prototypes on. There's actually somebody I work with in Intel that's part of that Tekton prototypes. But we've got a huge Jenkins user base right now, for instance, right? And I'm trying to figure out what do I do with that infrastructure, for instance, because Jenkins it's a beast, right? It's a it's a product of a different time. and hard to lock down. So.
Yeah. I mean, I know the Jenkins side is one of the hardest ones for us, and I know I don't want to be too myopic on it, but I know a few folks have begun to poke around with Jenkins, and a lot of and I don't want it to be like all is lost, but a lot of folks have said, I don't know if Jenkins is worth salsifying, because it might just be a ridiculous amount of effort that would require folks to redeploy all of their infrastructure that they're using for Jenkins anyway, in order to sort of implement, some of the basic security features that you would need. But there are folks who are looking to perhaps maybe sidestep the problem. I know we're looking at that at my company. We're looking to potentially build some tools that sidestep this, and this would be in the open source space, but we're working with some stuff first. That would include just essentially saying, having your Jenkins jobs call a separate secure build service, right? Because a lot of folks who are using Jenkins, they're not just using it purely for compilation and packaging. They're using it for compilation, packaging, QA tests, deployments to QA, to different environments. They're using it for like a million things. And SLSA is very, very much focused on the build and packaging step. And so if we can kind of maybe sidestep that and say, hey, here is a separate, almost small, not quite CI system, but a smaller system that can just focus on QA, that can focus, not on QA and any of those other things, but focus purely on the build and packaging. That might be something to get at least some salsa in your Jenkins environment. It still doesn't solve the Jenkins being insecure problem. But
right.
Yeah. And in addition, oh, go ahead.
So someone pointed me to when I mentioned that Jenkins was, we're having problems trying to figure out how to lock this thing down, right, and make it compliant. And someone immediately sends me an article from like 2020 that Jenkins has been certified as approved for use in military environments, and I guess they've got a custom container that has Jenkins with but as I read it, it was kind of like what we were thinking the solution probably needed to be, which is a Jenkins with a very specific lockdown set of plugins, and you don't get to change those, and you probably don't get to configure them either, and just all these restrictions that severely change the way people use Jenkins. But possibly that's like you were saying, that comes down to, in those build phases, they have to use that configuration, but elsewhere, they get freed up to do what they've always done. But I don't know, after a heavy Jenkins user once described it to me as a rootkit that happens to coordinate builds, that kind of summed up what I had seen on it. So.
Yeah, I've also I guess the meeting is going on because I actually have a bunch of thoughts around this. We could probably write something up, even maybe make it into something. So feel free for folks who want to stick on and chat about this, feel free to put your sort of name in here. But so there's a couple of things. One is we found and I don't remember exactly when this was, but we have been trying to talk to folks from the sort of Jenkins side of things around securing it and around making it, essentially what you were saying. And so obviously there's two problems. One is the reason why a lot of folks don't want to move off of Jenkins is because, hey, they have all this legacy stuff. They are using all these other plugins and yada, yada. And so when somebody comes in and says, hey, we can secure your Jenkins as long as you completely redeploy a completely different Jenkins, is not always helpful in those situations, because obviously, hey, if I was doing that, then why would I wouldn't necessarily need to keep going with Jenkins, except to say, I'm knowledgeable with Jenkins or something like that.
Right.
But one of the things we've been pointed to is there's a tool called Jenkins X. Jenkins X is Tecton based, and folks saying, hey, that Jenkins X is more of like the quote unquote secure Jenkins and that sort of thing. But obviously that's still the same problem. If folks don't want to move off of their existing infrastructure, then they're not going to want to move off of Jenkins to something like Tecton through Jenkins X. And and to be clear, this is the same thing we're seeing with inside of OpenSSF. There's a project called Fresca, which uses Tecton chains, Spiffy Spire. But for a lot of folks, it's like, hey, there's a lot of things here. I have a Jenkins. How can I use the Jenkins? But I think, to your point, the thing that we're seeing beyond all the, if we just assume for a second, based on a lot of the feedback we've gotten, that there's not a lot of interest, or even it's not particularly capable to take an existing Jenkins and secure it at least easily. And I think I really liked your point. Whoever had said, your friend or whatever, who had said that, Jenkins is a rootkit. I think the thing that we had seen and that we've been looking at is people are interested in having Jenkins perhaps call other services. So we're seeing some folks saying, hey, not like Tecton, but like small builders, like small secure build systems, and having Jenkins call those small secure build systems. And so at least that piece is secure. You're not, you're still, potentially there's issues with QA and, whatever else you might be doing, but the build piece is, the one that's running arbitrary code execution potentially. So if you can secure that, you're eliminating a bunch of stuff. And if you can kind of take that out of the hands of Jenkins, that might be good enough for some folks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's some effort to move people into, have their runners all, running in Kubernetes instances and so on. And same thing actually for our GitHub Actions is the other side that we use, but due to security policy, it's all internal runners, and so there's some effort bringing up Kubernetes based runners for that, right? And that's working, and it's relatively painless to go from external stuff to internal. But Jenkins just figuring out how to secure the controller, let alone adapt the typical way that people seem to connect their runners to Jenkins. So it's all something we're trying to solve, and I'm trying to find as many experts that are willing to help me. But at this point, it's hard to find people with time or even the motivation to change the way they work, right, as you mentioned.
So I mean, I know we've talked to a few folks in the past, and I know this group is at least open to helping foster that, something like that. Without getting into too many, without it, motivating people to spend time trying to secure Jenkins is always going to be hard. That's that's one big issue. And then there's a lot of folks who, I was at a DevOps meetup yesterday where, one of the things that was talked about was, is it worth the, even within an organization, is it worth the time and effort to secure something that is kind of insecure by default? By the time you've figured out all the right ways to run it and yada yada, it's you've already done enough work to move off of Jenkins, or more than enough work to move off of it in the first place.
Right.
So there's stuff there, and then also to what you had said as well. If folks who they're saying, hey, we don't want to move off of Jenkins because a lot of times people don't want to move off of Jenkins is because they're able to do things that if you locked it down and did all the right security things, they wouldn't be allowed to do. And which leads, which leads to the other thing, which is why, I mean, I'm very interested to see if folks if there's any interest in sort of sidestepping the problem and focusing more on quote unquote a secure builder, right? Like a thing, whether it is, Jenkins spins up like a particular container or VM image that is locked down in specific ways, you know, and that sort of thing. So for example, you know, one of the things I had done in a past life, because we were using Jenkins at a lot of places and it was a huge mess, was we had, you know, we had a lot of the secure jobs that had to run, ran like, you know, Jenkins would call something else and that something else was locked down. And so that would be the thing that actually ran those secure builds, and not Jenkins itself, but Jenkins could still be used for all the additional orchestration, like pulling down, you know, tests and running them, and, you know, deploying to different environments, and, you know, all that sort of stuff.
Right. I mean, I guess so. You know, our environment is, you know, we're kind of at an interesting point for some of the stuff that you're talking about, in that there's an effort to move people from, you know, just running their own Jenkins controllers in, you know, random labs or under their desks, or, you know, whatever the typical history has been, to IT hosted runners, right? And you know, it's all a you know, CloudBees, Jenkins, and, you know, so on. And so there is a little bit of work that needs to be done to move from one environment to the other, just in reprovisioning and everything else. And of course, now once you go into IT and they're running these runners in Kubernetes instance instead of on their own machine and all that kind of stuff, where teams are used to having these controllers with, you know, 32 cores and gigs of RAM, and they're doing all this processing and custom plugins and all this kind of stuff. IT's like, you know, look, you're killing us. You need to move this workload out to your runners. And so, you know, just looking at what IT is requesting that people do, you know, for the good of the entire system and stability of that, you know, it's kind of one of those points where, you know, like you're saying, people are going to have to change the way they do a lot of things, and so we can possibly capture them, right, and cause some other changes in the way they use it. And so, so yeah, if there's a, you know, I guess my initial ping to see if there were other Jenkins users. I mean, if there's you know, a small community that wanted to collaborate on, you know, learnings of adapting stuff, putting together a BKM, right? Can we even get to level 2, let alone 3, right? You know, something like that. You know, that's definitely something that I'm interested in joining and participating and contributing to. So, and you know, like I said, we've kind of got that perfect storm internally in our environment, and that we can capture a lot of people being forced to move to this new environment, that we can possibly disabuse them of using some of the problematic features.
Can I just ask for level 2, what do you need in general compliance?
Oh, sorry, you cut out there a little bit there, Mikey. Can you repeat that?
I don't know. I don't have a good service here, but I was at level 2, basically signing a provenance, but anything else?
Oh, yeah. So most likely Jenkins could hit level 2 as long as you had a mechanism in the plugin to actually do signing. So level 3 is definitely a bit of a stretch, and would probably require a good deal of, you know, looking at Jenkins to see how that might be possible. And in fact, I believe there's a couple of plugins. One plugin is under the SLSA framework. It was contributed to us by Samsung. The problem is that once they contributed it, nobody has continued to maintain it. And for a lot of folks, you know, a lot of us don't really know or use Jenkins anymore. So we're not super familiar with how to sort of maintain that plugin and maybe try and see if it'll get up to the next level. There was also something on, I think the Intoto folks had made one as well. I don't remember exactly where that lives, but let me send some links over in a second.
And you're referring to that SLSA level 1 generator project under the SLSA org.
Yeah. So that one, it was one that was contributed by Samsung to the project. But there's also one that in Toto Jenkins is this one. There is yeah, so there is.
You actually need like a plugin to get to level 2.
Well, so you need to have some way of doing the signing, and so you could have something that's like different steps outside of the end user control, probably, maybe, like there's probably some way you can still do that without the plugin, but the plugin just makes it, I guess, easier.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I thought about all that, and the issue with just isolating the signing key access from the other plugins, right? So that's where the severely locking down plugins aspect comes in, which I don't know how practical that is for general Jenkins users.
Yeah. So I mean, I still do wonder, like, would giving Jenkins access to spin up something like a secure builder, but where Jenkins itself would not have the ability to modify what that secure builder is running, would that be good enough for most folks who use Jenkins? Or the answer is like, no. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I think that a feature like that would be awesome, not only for Jenkins, but like across the board. Any builder that does not comply to SLSA can like run, I don't know, like a Docker Compose or whatever you imagine, and build this above a system above it. Like, I think it's a very useful tool, even locally, to try it,
Yeah.
So now, in an environment where you have a Kubernetes cluster doing your runners, does Jenkins plus, admittedly, I don't know enough about Tekton to talk super intelligently about it, but would combining a Jenkins with Tekton, where Tekton's your runner, I mean, you're kind of doubling up on your infrastructure there, I guess, but.
Yes, so that could definitely work. I think most folks would probably want something simpler, right? Like most folks are not going to want to probably say, hey, because the folks who once again, not everybody wants to move off of Jenkins, yada, but also then a lot of folks are like, hey, I don't want to necessarily, especially for people who aren't using cloud native. 1 second here. When you have folks who are not using cloud native, and for those folks, they still want something, even if it's by cloud native, I just more mean like Kubernetes in this context. Like some there's a lot of stuff in Jenkins that you can call Kubernetes, you can call containers and yada. But even for folks who are using containers, like spinning up an entire Kubernetes cluster that just for running these sorts of builds, depending on maturity, could be either pretty easy or very, very difficult. So that's a concern. And so I was actually thinking, based on, like, if you look at, for example, there's like build packs and there's all these other things that are out there. Could you leverage something like, and this is, maybe playing a little, putting it out there, like some folks like myself are looking at, could you use micro VMs or something like that anywhere, have some sort of very simple hook into it so Jenkins can say, hey, I want to spin this thing up, and the way that it's structured is Jenkins will not have access to actually do much more than just say, here's how the build works. Whatever this thing is, we'll spin up the micro VM, it'll run the build, it'll run the compilation, it'll do whatever. but it'll do it and then also do all there'll be a wrapper around that does the signing and all that stuff. And so that it's kind of this little encapsulated thing that would be, maybe one minor, daemon that runs on a machine plus, the ability to spin up these micro VMs, right? Some code to spin up those things. And then everything else is essentially the same as your normal build. I wonder if that, there seem to be some folks poking around that sort of idea. So as opposed to spinning up a whole thing, you just sort of say, hey, I run this thing on my runners and that thing does this extra stuff. Something like that. I don't know if I confused folks there. Sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, you're talking about like a structure to kind of implement GitHub action runners to some extent, right? The ephemeral runners kind of thing.
Sorta, but I would say it's kind of just even more just simple. Like it's just like the thing that, so if I take a step back, right, what are the issues why, Jenkins can't really maybe hit some of those high level salsa things is because it's very difficult there's a couple of things. One is it can be difficult for, especially a lot of folks who are running different infrastructure to, because I know a lot of folks who are still, their builds all run on a single build machine and not like virtualized in some way or not containerized in some way. So you end up with situations where one build could potentially see the output of other builds, which is, or inputs of other builds and start to mess with other builds, and that sort of thing makes it impossible to do salsa, or at least salsa level 3. Or maybe even salsa level 2. I have to double check it's been.
Well, I mean, you see that with, GitHub Actions with self-hosted runners, right? I mean,
yes.
People set up a machine and, it's all over, bad habits appear. So, yep. Yeah, we're trying to cut that off before it gets too heavily ingrained. But it's as you can imagine, Intel is a big company, and so you're always finding somebody with a new CI that you're trying to bring into the fold. So
yeah. And so there is that sort of problem, and how do you kind of, so there has to be something like that, and so if we look at some of the other stuff with Jenkins, the plugins, right? The plugins can potentially see whatever any of the other plugins look at, and there's not really a great mechanism within Jenkins for like capabilities, right? Where you could say, hey, this plugin is a security plugin, so it needs to see everything, versus this plugin is, a plugin that like, I don't know, shows, changes the colors of the lights. The one that changes.
There's no sandboxes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's my concern with all the plugins, and because Jenkins is so flexible, which is great for what a lot of people want to use it for. That's why they use it, right? But sometimes you see the custom plugins that teams build, and they're doing serious computation and a lot of what you would consider the builder stage actually in plugins. And just the way they use the Jenkins controller storage and things like that has mass potential to stomp on things, right, and interfere with each other's builds if something kicks off at the wrong times, and then they use a plugin to make sure that they don't run at the same time. And I mean, it's plugins all the way down, right? And so yeah, those are again the culture of usage that would need to be dealt with.
Yeah. So on that end, yeah, that is something that, regardless of whatever you do, that has to be prevented. Because like if you just allow folks to, because the, Salsa has the concept of the trusted control plane. In this case, the trusted control plane being the Jenkins orchestrator, right? The Jenkins primary.
Mm-hmm.
And if you allow developers to sort of be able to mess with that itself, then there's just no way you could potentially lock it down and
Right.
secure it. But assuming you're
Right.
able to do that, you know, you still have obviously, you know, a lot of folks who are going to be like, hey, I run my, you know, I run my build, but then my build kicks off QA and kicks off all these other things. And so even though my build maybe is something like Maven build or you know, just running make that just calls GCC or something, beyond that, you know, there's a million other steps to then say, okay, well, now it gets deployed to 12 different environments and Jenkins keeps track of all that and yada, yada. And so I totally get why, you know, when folks say, hey, I can't just move to Tecton, I can't even just move to GitHub Actions, right? Because if this was, even if we ran GitHub, right, you know, if this was something that I could just plop in, you know, the build, sure, but everything else I can't. And so that's kind of where, you know, a lot of folks have been asking about like something like a very minimal CI, right? But not actually CI, just a very minimal build system that all it can do is take requests to run build and packaging, because once again, that's where SLSA comes in mostly, right? You can technically SLSAfy your entire, you know, pipeline, but that's really not the core intent. And that's not where you get the majority of the benefit. The majority of the benefit is mostly in that, like,
Right.
I looked at the inputs and I recorded it. I looked at what you did in the build and recorded it. And I looked at what the output was and recorded it. So if somebody else reports something different, something's gone wrong. You know, so if you publish whatever, something with hash X and something comes out with hash Y, you know that, you know, something has tried to compromise it, that kind of thing. So one quick thing that I just wanted to ask is, so would that, like, do, you know, for your use cases, is there enough like super custom logic that even saying something like that is too complicated, or is passing something like that to a secure builder of use?
So yeah, as we've been talking, yeah, I've been, you know, it's now going. I'm realizing that I definitely need to make sure. You know, it's every time I have a conversation about SLSA, and of course it blows up to, like, you're going to make me change. You know what? And then the immediate question, which every engineer asks when they don't want to do work, which is, what's the business value? Is you know, of you know, why are you going to make me do this, right? But you know, you pushing through that to make sure, you know, some of the uphill battle can be solved by making sure the messaging is there, that they only need to really worry about this on their build controller, because, you know, we, like you said, people are using it for everything, you know, deployment across everything through testing and whatever. And so you can imagine, you know, Intel has a lot of test labs with specialized hardware and things like that. And, you know, a lot of people use Jenkins in those labs to, you know, deploy mass testing across their nodes and things like that, where, you know, they have to do all sorts of, you know, interesting things on their runner just to, you know, access the hardware and control it and all that kind of stuff. And we don't want to prevent that. So it may be that, you know, from the you know, is a runner compliant? Maybe in the Jenkins space, you know, one tool is one that can scan the configuration and, you know, look for things that are, you know, this controller can be compliant and or won't be compliant, right?
You want a wacky edge case? I used to work for a project called the WPI Lib, and WPI Lib is a bunch of robotics software used for high school students for the first robotics competition. And the CI that I set up with Jenkins has to SSH the entire test bed over to a RoboRio, which is a remote system, and then runs all of the unit tests on a like a live test bed that has like actual motor controllers attached to it, wires, you know, PWM, sort of like doing all that automated testing. And like, you know, you're totally, you know, breaking outside of the infrastructure, running tests out there, and then coming back in with the results at the end. And like that, you can't not do that because you can't really reasonably run a Jenkins runner on the embedded controller that you're trying to test.
Okay. So I hate to hijack the entire agenda today with my question, but
yeah. So
No, I
we had
think
no
this is
agenda.
great. I mean, this is the kind of conversation that we should have.
So Mikey asks a question, maybe connected question or not. Does recording the file system syscalls on the machine enough for SLSA level 3 without having a specific builder? Not exactly. I mean, there's definitely some areas where doing stuff like eBPF and so on could help out, like especially if we end up going like a SLSA level 4. I think the big thing is, right, because like recording those syscalls still needs to happen in a trusted control plane, and in something like the Jenkins situation where it's really hard to sort of right now delineate between those two things and essentially enforce like that the syscalls are being recorded in the first place is kind of difficult, which is why I think like almost sort of splitting it up where you say, imagine, it's like just for the sake of argument here, you have a very simple, we call it the secure SLSA builder API, right? And Jenkins calls the secure SLSA builder API as opposed to saying Jenkins itself does the SLSA stuff. And so Jenkins goes and says, hey, run this, run the build against this, let's just say for example, it's just like run make against this commit, right? Okay, cool. That secure builder goes and records that, pulls down the code, pulls down dependencies, runs all of that. That sort of little API orchestrates some stuff, does all that. Spins up the build in something secure like a micro VM or a container with isolated network or whatever, something that your Jenkins would not have access to, right? Because once again, in this context, the Jenkins is not the secure build control plane. I think that sort of thing is, at that point, you've kind of hit everything. I think that's kind of like where I would lean towards, as opposed to trying to, but that's just my 2 cents. Sorry. I hope that answered the question,
The
right?
SLSA level, it does answer my question, but I'm a bit confused.
Mikey, if you're saying talking
Confused about what is required by SLSA level to understand what the okay, never mind. I don't have a good service.
Oh,
so thank
yeah,
you.
but if I got the gist of it, it's, hey, what are the things that count towards hitting SLSA level? Which one, 2 or 3? But yeah, so for SLSA level,
about 3, like, do I need? Sorry, I just I think clarify. Do I need to actually have a secure build, or do I need to securely monitor what happens?
So you need to securely monitor what happens in the build. The problem here with something like a Jenkins is, how do you do that if you're not locking down Jenkins itself? Like, so there's 2 main things. One is the only thing from the build side that needs to be secured, and once again, this is still the responsibility of the Jenkins, is the builder cannot mess with whatever is the build that you're running cannot mess with other builds either in time or space. So like it cannot mess with another build that's happening at the same time. So, you can't have 2 builds, let's say, running on the same infrastructure that can in any way interact. And then at the same time, one of the things that's happened in the past is if you don't want to have a situation where, let's say I have a bad build, right? Well, we have a bunch of caching. So all the stuff that got built by that builder gets cached in some way. So now all the future builds are pulling from a malicious cache. So the thing there is you want to prevent that sort of thing from happening as well.
You will hate Gradle.
Yeah.
No, okay. So Gradle has this thing called the Gradle build cache, which is used in enterprises primarily. And it's this cache that is this distributed cache where every single build is writing and reading from the centralized cache for compilation steps, stuff like that. So like if you've compiled a project previously on one build, then the compiler doesn't need to run again, which is significant for performance. Like
yes,
hella performance improvement, and it makes local development significantly faster. But you're gonna hate Gradle.
Yeah. So with that said, right, like there are discussions around that area of how do you create like what we're calling like a secure build cache, like something where imagine, hey, if you're doing all the right things from a SLSA standpoint, and these are things that that'll probably be discussed in the months to come. One of the things that we want to be able to do is we want to be able to have like that ability to say, hey, here is a build cache. This build cache can, still, you can still use that build cache, but there's going to be rules around it and there's going to be ways to secure it. And I know that's going to involve probably figuring out how to work with Gradle to implement that. But yes. At least in this initial stuff, we're looking to kind of separate from those two things. Okay.
So going back to the Jenkins option, instead of having like a different plugin and like pushing some feature behind the scenes, can I have like a template pipeline that uses different agents, different machines to build and to create this providence to hit this results at level 3?
So
like if you tell me how to run my pipeline, no problem, but don't add any new content. Tell me how many machines you want, no problem.
Yeah, so you might be able to do that, but it would require like essentially the same way that you're doing reusable work, where we're using reusable workflows. You need to make sure that the pipeline is in no way configurable by the end user at that point, right? The only inputs are stuff like, the commit hash, maybe a couple of, parameters. But at that point, right, you're already, so that's definitely one way to go about it. And then that's also assuming that you've also locked down the Jenkins itself to make sure that the various plugins you're using are not messing with anything as well.
Thanks.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, I had implemented that sort of pattern at a previous job. And it led to some interesting effects, which is, obviously developers, they don't care about their build. In fact, want it to be as simple as possible until they care about their build and want to be able to do anything they want in it. And so that was always the kind of back and forth there, right? Was, hey, you're telling me I can't have custom steps in my build. And they push back against that, but then they also don't want to be I've also found that, when you say, okay, great, now secure those steps, they don't want to do that either. So it's a little bit of an interesting conundrum there. But to Matthew, I think if folks are interested, I think we would be like this group, or who an interested set of folks might be very would be interested in seeing what sorts of general things, even to hit, let's say, a SLSA level 2 or whatever, in a decent way might be, via Jenkins might be something that we could look at.
Yeah, level 2 is kind of what what I'm targeting with this one, and there's all the stuff we talked about, right? Restricting plugins and everything else is on the table for what I'm thinking we need to do, right? And the people I've talked to, within the company all seem to kind of shake their head and go, yeah, well, that's probably what you're going to need to do, and it's not going to be, you're not going to be popular when you're telling people they can and can't do things. But then as long as we can make sure people understand that maybe they just need to, in some cases, split their controllers to put their build tasks onto one, and their test and other tasks that they do need to customize and maybe control in some more exotic ways, that it's like, okay, fine, go ahead and do that. Because we're, like I said, we're moving to a IT hosted controllers kind of environment, and there's more push to use the Jenkins configuration as code feature set and things like that maybe we have some opportunity to kind of move the users as they do this, because like I said, IT is just telling people, hey, can you can better affect the system, right? Or less affect the system and increase the stability for everybody by moving certain types of workloads out of the controllers, right? Your controller shouldn't need 64 cores and gigs and gigs of RAM to run. It should be doling out tasks to the runners instead, right? So I think we, at least we have the opportunity, I think, to enlist IT to leverage some of their their requests for people to change the way their workloads work, to also benefit moving towards at least a SLSA level 2. But yeah, I'm still trying to fully understand like the Groovy script sandbox and things like that. And so as teams use custom Groovy scripts in their pipelines and things like that, how much do they actually have access to the controller to be able to customize the control plane via that method and so on?
Yeah, so it's, so on that end, the Groovy sandbox is actually pretty good at blocking the ability for jobs to be able to access stuff on the controller end. The problem more is it just makes it very difficult for something like SLSA to then know exactly what it needs to be looking at. Like if you had a SLSA plugin or you were wrapping it up, there's a lot of stuff there that gets super complicated. And there's a lot of areas where you can, it would be very easy for if you gave folks to the even the Groovy sandbox, that they wouldn't be able to mess with other builds, they wouldn't be able to mess with the controller, but they'd be able to falsify the results of their own build, which is what you don't want.
Right.
Yeah. One of the, well, I mean, so I know one of the other things that from our end that we're actually interested in talking to the folks from like Intel and similar on is stuff like longer term, looking at stuff like Intel TDX and similar for running builds within like a context of like, because one of the things that folks have talked about is, could you avoid certain elements of the secure of a secure control plane by actually enforcing behavior at the hardware level via stuff like TPM attestations and trusted enclave execution and that sort of thing. So it's like, yep, even if something wanted to mess with this, we believe that to not be able to actually do that and not to be the case. So that kind of, you're able to
and
a lot of that.
There's research in that space happening, right? So Marcella, I'm blanking on her last name right now, so it's not even 8 o'clock here, so I'm not fully operational yet. She, she's working in the spec side of SLSA
Oh,
quite a
yes.
bit, but they have a lot of prototypes going on related to how can you do your runners in an enclave or TDX VM so that you can use it to attest that you have a certain environment and it's able to monitor what's happening and things like that, and you're able to attest to the actual hardware config that it ran on, right? So yeah, there's definite opportunity to leverage that in the future, right? Because got to deploy that hardware to actually run that in the build environment, and even Intel has restrictions on how much of that it can deploy, right? So every chip with that feature is being sold to paying customers before we usually get it internal. So that happens in the best of times as well as current environments. But yeah, anything we can sell, we do, right? So yeah.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely a future direction.
Yeah.
And I talk to her at least once or twice a week on stuff that she's doing.
Cool. Yeah. And I know that, doing this in the startup life, we also cannot afford that hardware, at least yet, but we're very interested in seeing where it goes, and also perhaps renting that hardware from a cloud provider for very short amounts of time.
Right.
Yeah, but that's cool. Yeah. So I know, there's some stuff, right, that's discussed around there as well. But yeah, this is super useful. I will spend some time just kind of prepping a document so that I'll share inside of the SLSA-tooling chat in a little bit, and we can probably just start throwing just a couple of thoughts out there. Matthew, I know you've probably been working with Jenkins more than the rest of us recently. The last time I've tried to avoid that Jenkins life since 2021. So
I have largely managed to avoid it until about the last 6 months, and then I've learned way more about Jenkins than I've ever wanted. So
yeah. So I do think this is going to be an interesting project, probably consisting of both a set of like rules around, like the way I'm thinking of it is based on what you had said, is like, hey, here are things that you should do to secure and lock stuff down. And then here are also perhaps ways to sidestep it by using other, like, not saying you need to get rid of your Jenkins, but to say, hey, as opposed to running this sort of runner, right, which is potentially insecure and would lead to breaking these SLSA requirements, you could do this other sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. Generating some sort of, best known configuration.
Yep.
Kind of documentation. I think, like you said, not only useful to Intel, but I think just industry in general would be, there's enough Jenkins users that I think it would get consumed.
Yeah. Second. Okay. Yeah. So I'll set that up. I'll send it out. I know we only have 5 minutes left, but does anybody else have any other things they wanted to bring up? And then also, if folks know people who use Jenkins, who want to salsify Jenkins and are interested in actually contributing, please bring them along. Definitely want folks on this side. We can probably, within a few weeks, even write up a quick guide that I think would be really useful to folks. And then, as Matthew said, maybe even have a set of like example configurations to that we could release.
Yeah, I think if we come up with something, I can probably convince people that we can either release it to the community or release it as open source through Intel.
Cool. Any other things folks wanted to bring up in the last couple of minutes? Otherwise, see you all next week. And I'll also be reaching out to some folks about maybe trying to promote this this meeting a bit more, so that we get a little bit more engagement and a little bit more folks who are interested in participating and contributing to these things.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't be so shy and advertise it like on the other SLSA related channels.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And so, yes. Cool. I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.